Can an act of kindness save a soul, or will it burn your entire world to the ground? For the widow Hannah Moore, the answer would come down to a single cup of water. In a wild land that had already taken everything from her, all she had left was a little water and a stubborn sense of pride. Until the day she found a man dying in the scrub, an Apache warrior, the sworn enemy of her people. To save him would be to defy her town. To leave him would be to betray herself. The sun beat down on the homestead, bleaching the very color from the sky. The earth was baked hard, fractured into 1,000 pieces like a shattered clay pot, thirsty for a rain that never came. Hannah Moore shielded her eyes with a calloused hand, the silence of the plains pressing in on all sides. It was a heavy silence, filled with the drone of insects and the memory of a voice she would never hear again. Her shoulders ached from the fight with the old well pump, coaxing just enough water to wet her throat and fill a small bucket for the morning. There was little of anything left, little water, little money, and precious little hope. The ranch was all she had, a legacy of sweat and sorrow left by a husband the fever had claimed last winter. Dry Hollow had buried him, and then, in its own quiet way, tried to bury her too, with looks that said a woman alone was a problem to be solved, a loose thread in their tidy, unforgiving world. She was too young, they whispered, but far too proud to accept any of the clumsy offers of marriage that followed. A lone hawk carved lazy circles against the vast, empty blue, its shadow drifting over the parched grass. It was then her gaze caught on something down by the dry creek bed. A heap of old blankets, perhaps, discarded by some traveler, but it was out of place. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't felt in months, pulled her from the porch dot as she drew closer, her steps slowing in the fine way. Dust, the shape resolved itself. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a man curled on his side like a child. His chest gave a shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall. The ground beneath him was stained a dark, angry color, the blood already baked black by the heat. His dark hair was matted with dirt, and he wore only a simple leather shirt, torn at the shoulder to reveal a wound so deep she could see the glint of bone. Then she saw the adornment around, his neck a single feather tied with beads, Apache her. Heart hammered against her ribs. Every cautionary tale from her childhood, every grim story told in hushed tones around the potbelly stove at the general store, rushed into her mind. Tales of raids, of fire in the night, fear, cold and sharp, told her to turn back. She took one step, then another, her boots crunching on the gravel, but then he made a sound. Not a threat, not a word, but a low guttural moan of pure agony as he tried, and failed, to shift his weight. The fear was still there, but something else rose to meet it. The stories were about warriors and demons. This was just a man bleeding his life into the unforgiving soil. And she was the only soul for miles to see it. The town wouldn't come. The sheriff would call it justice. She turned, not toward the safety of her house, but toward the barn where the bucket of precious, murky water sat in the shade. Moments later, she knelt beside him. The metallic smell of blood was strong. She didn't say a word. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she gently lifted his head and brought the tin cup to his lips. His eyes flickered open. They were black, bottomless, and for a heartbeat wild. They fixed on hers, holding a universe of pain and defiance. He didn't drink. She waited, her own muscles trembling from the strain. Then slowly, his cracked lips parted. He took a sip. She heard the small, dry sound of his swallow. It was barely a mouthful, but it was everything. When he was done, she gently lowered his head and rose to her feet. He watched her for a long moment, the wildness in his eyes softening into something unreadable. Then he closed them, a long, quiet exhale leaving his body. Hannah walked back toward the silhouette of her house, the weight of her choice settling in her bones. She couldn't know if she had just postponed a death or invited it to her own door. Sleep did not come that night. Hannah sat in the dark by her window, the old rifle across her lap, listening to the coyotes cry to a sliver of moon. Before the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, a new sound began. It wasn't thunder. It was a feeling that came up from the soles of her feet, a deep, rhythmic pulse in the earth itself. She was on the porch in an instant. They flowed over the ridge like a dark river, dozens of riders emerging from the pre-dawn gloom. They were not a chaotic mob. They moved with a disciplined silence, their forms stark against the brightening horizon. No shouts, no war cries, only the steady, heart-like beat of hooves on hard-packed dirt, a sound that grew until it filled the world. She froze, one hand gripping the weathered wood of the porch column. Then she retreated into the house, her hands finding the cold, heavy steel of her late husband's rifle. It wasn't loaded. She wouldn't know how to fire it, even if it were. But it was a hollow bluff, and a bluff was better than standing empty-handed. When she returned to the doorway, they were there. Her homestead was surrounded, a silent ring of judgment. Warriors sat astride their ponies, their faces painted in grim lines of ochre and black, their eyes fixed on her. The morning breeze stirred the feathers in their hair, but the men themselves were as still as the rock formations behind them. Then, a space opened in the line, and she saw him, the man from the creek bed. He sat tall on a pinto, though she could see the strain in his posture, the pallor of his skin beneath the grime and dried blood. He rode to the front, and the collective gaze of the warriors never left him. He was not their prisoner. He was their purpose. He dismounted, the soft scrape of his moccasins on the dirt the only sound in the charged air. He limped as he approached, a slight lean betraying the pain he refused to show on his face. He stopped 10 feet from her porch steps, his eyes locking with hers. They held no malice, only a profound and weary weight that the silence stretched, thin and tight. He looked at her, at the rifle in her hands, then back to her face. He spoke a single word in his own tongue, a word that sounded like rock and river. She didn't understand its meaning, but she felt its force. It was not a question. It was a declaration. Then he turned his gaze from her to his men. His voice was low, but it cut through the morning air with absolute authority. He spoke several short, clipped sentences. The effect was immediate. The tension that had held the yard in a state of suspended violence broke. Shoulders relaxed. The grips on lances and rifles loosened. A few of the men nodded, their expressions shifting from cold fury to a quiet, grudging respect. Just as silently as they had come, they began to leave. They turned their ponies and melted back over the ridge, leaving nothing behind but the prints of their passage in the dust. All except one. The wounded man remained. He walked past her, his eyes on the horizon, and went to the water trough. He didn't drink, but sat in its meager shade, his back against a sturdy post as if he had been born to that spot. He was a sentinel now, his watch begun. Hannah finally found her voice, a sound as dry as the grass at her feet. "What do you want?" He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You gave life," he said, his own voice a low rasp of disuse. "I will see that you keep it." He looked away then, back toward the empty plains. Hannah stood in the doorway, the useless rifle suddenly a leaden weight in her arms. A silent war had been declared and won on her land before the sun was fully up, but she understood that her own struggle had only just begun. The days that followed fell into a strange and quiet rhythm. The man whose name she did not know became a fixture of the homestead, as constant as the creak of the old windmill. He never came inside the house, sleeping in the shelter of the barn, but his presence filled the empty spaces of the ranch. The sagging gate she'd wrestled with for a week was suddenly firm on its hinges. The woodpile by the door, once dwindling, grew into a neatly stacked fortress against the coming chill. He asked for nothing and offered no words, but his actions spoke a language of quiet reciprocity. At first, she left a plate of food on the porch rail. It would sit untouched for an hour before disappearing when she wasn't looking. After the third day, she set 2 places at the small weathered table on the porch. He came and sat after she had taken her first bite, and they ate in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. But peace was a fragile thing. When the flour sack ran empty, she had no choice but to ride into Dry Hollow. The moment she pushed through the doors of the general store, a blanket of silence fell over the room. It was a thick, suffocating quiet. Men who had known her since she was a girl suddenly found fascinating things to study on the shelves. Henderson, the proprietor, polished a clean spot on his counter, his gaze fixed on the wood grain. It was Brody, a rancher whose land bordered hers, who broke the spell. His voice was slick with malice. "Heard you're keeping some interesting company out there, Hannah." She ignored him, placing a small bag of beans on the counter. Another man snickered. "Some say it's more than just company. Say the widow ain't so lonely after all." The words were meant to sting, and they did. Sheriff Maddox, standing by the pickle barrel, cleared his throat. "Now that's enough of that." But his voice held no authority, only a weary desire to avoid trouble. Hannah paid for her goods, her back straight, her chin held high. She could feel their eyes on her as she left, the whispers rising like heat from the dusty floorboards. That evening, she found the man by the corral, sharpening a small, wicked-looking blade on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "They think I am your whore," she said, the words falling like chips of stone into the quiet air. He didn't stop his work, but the steady rhythm faltered for a half-beat. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers in the fading light. "Their mouths make noise," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is only wind passing through teeth." But the wind carried sparks. A few nights later, she was jolted from her sleep by the sound of splintering wood and the raw, drunken laughter of men. An orange light flickered against her window. She ran to the door and saw flames were consuming the small chicken coop. 4 men, their faces ugly in the firelight, were in her yard. One held a rope. "Come on out, Hannah girl." Brody shouted, his voice thick with drink. "We just want to have a word with your pet savage." She reached for the rifle, her hands shaking, but a shadow had already detached itself from the barn. It was not the movement of a man. It was the blur of a predator unleashed. There was a sickening crunch as Brody's associate was thrown to the ground. A scream was cut short as another man went down, clutching his knee. The fight, if it could be called that, was over in less than a minute. The yard was suddenly still, save for the crackle of the fire and the low, pained moans of the men writhing in the dirt. The man stood over them, his chest heaving, the knife a sliver of deadly light in his hand. He turned his head and looked at her where she stood frozen in the doorway. In his eyes, she saw the same controlled fury that had dispatched her attackers. "The danger is not gone," he said, his voice calm and steady. "So I do not go." Hannah could only nod, the cold, useless rifle still clutched in her hands. She was looking at a man who could take a life as easily as he could mend a fence, and in that terrifying moment, she had never felt safer. By dawn, the broken men were gone. Hannah didn't ask where, and he offered no explanation. The only evidence of their visit was the smell of ash on the wind and a few dark stains in the dirt that she tried not to look at too closely. They spent the morning in silence, dousing the last of the embers and pulling charred timbers from the ruins of the coop. The shared grim work was a conversation in itself, forging a bond in the smoky air between them. Late that afternoon, a dust cloud on the road announced the arrival of the law. Sheriff Maddox didn't come alone this time. He was flanked by 2 deputies, their faces hard and sun-scorched. Maddox dismounted, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness that felt hollow. "Hannah," he began, his eyes scanning the yard. "We had a report of some commotion." "Some men paid a visit," Hannah said, her voice flat. She didn't move from the porch. "They've since left." One of the deputies spat into the dust. "Maybe they were just trying to clear out a pest for the good of the town." Hannah's gaze snapped to the deputy, cold and sharp. "They came with torches and rope in the middle of the night." "You have a strange idea of civic duty, sir." Before the deputy could retort, a presence made itself known. The man emerged from the barn, weaponless, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He simply stood there, watching, a pillar of quiet menace. The deputy's hands instinctively drifted toward their pistols. "Stand down!" Maddox barked, his voice tight with alarm. He turned back to Hannah, his face a mask of exasperation. "You see, this is what I'm talking about. This situation is a powder keg. You have to make a choice, Hannah. It's the town, or it's him. You can't have both." Hannah looked from the sheriff's strained face to the silent figure by the barn, then back again. A long moment passed, measured by the whisper of the wind. "I believe I already have," she said softly. Maddox left with a shake of his head, his deputies glaring back at her with open hostility. That night, the air grew cold. They sat by a small fire, the vast star-filled sky pressing down on them. The shared danger had chipped away another stone from the wall between them. "They will kill you to get to me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He poked the embers with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. "My grandmother used to say that a soul is like a fire," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Some are born as embers, needing only a little breath to grow. Others are born as bonfires, and people will travel for miles just to feel their heat." He looked at her, his face half in shadow, half in flickering light. "They are not afraid of me, Hannah. They are afraid of the bonfire they see in you." She felt the truth of his words settle in her bones, and with it, a lifetime of silence began to break. "My husband James," she began, her voice unsteady. "He liked me best when I was small. Quiet. He built a life for me, but it was a box. I think I've been in it for so long. I forgot how to stand up straight." He said nothing, but his stillness was a form of listening she had never known. The next time, they came not with drunken shouts, but with a chilling purpose. It was Brody and his closest men, their faces hidden by bandanas. One of them carried a branding iron, its tip glowing a malevolent red in the dark. "No more games, Hannah." Brody's voice cut through the night. "You harbor that animal. You get the brand of an animal lover." This time, Hannah didn't hesitate. She ran inside for the rifle as the man whose name she now knew was Takota moved to meet the threat. The sounds were brutal and quick. But as Takota subdued one man, Brody stepped clear, leveling a pistol. Takota! The name was torn from her throat. She stood on the porch, the long rifle in her hands, its heavy barrel aimed directly at Brody's chest. The world seemed to stop. Her arms trembled, but her voice was as clear and cold as well water. "Drop it." Brody stared, his eyes wide with disbelief above his bandana. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare." "He spared you once," she said, her voice ringing with a power she hadn't known she possessed. "Try me and see if I'm as merciful." It wasn't Takota's formidable presence that made Brody finally slowly lower his gun. It was the unwavering fire in the eyes of the woman in the doorway. He and his men backed away, dragging their wounded, and vanished into the night. Hannah stood there for a long time, the rifle still raised, feeling the vast open shape of the sky all around her. The summer heat pressed down, driving Hannah to seek refuge in the dusty loft of the barn. It was there, while sorting through a heavy cedar chest of her late husband's belongings, that she found it. Tucked inside an old account ledger was a folded piece of paper. James's handwriting, as precise and cold as the man himself, seemed to leap from the page. To Mr. Brody, it read, "Regarding our discussion, I agree to the sale of the property at the price offered. I trust your discretion in this matter until such time as my wife can be made to see reason. Finalizing the papers should be a swift affair. The date was 3 weeks before the fever took him. The air in the loft turned to ice. It wasn't just Brody's avarice. It was a betrayal that reached from the grave. Every cold shoulder from James, every hollow compliment, every insistence that he knew what was best for her, it all snapped into focus. He had been selling her future from under her feet. A cold, clean anger burned away the last vestiges of her grief. Takota found her there, sitting on the dusty floorboards, drawn by a silence that was heavier than usual. She didn't speak. She simply held out the letter. He read it once, his expression unchanging, but a muscle tightened along his jawline. He folded it carefully and handed it back. He did not love this land, Takota said, his voice quiet but absolute. He loved the idea of owning it. And you. The words were not an accusation. They were a key turning in a lock she hadn't known she was trapped behind. The next morning, she rode to town alone. She wore her Sunday dress, a dark calico of faded blue, and pinned her hair with a deliberate care she hadn't felt in years. She walked into the courthouse, her boots making a determined sound on the wooden floors, and asked to see Judge Leland. In his office, surrounded by towers of dusty books, she laid the letter on his desk. "This was my husband's intention, Judge. It was never a contract," she said, her voice steady. "Mr. Brody has been trying to collect on a dead man's promise, using fire and fear as his currency." The judge adjusted his spectacles, studying her face. Then the letter. "I will look into the county records, Mrs. Moore." 2 days later, the hearing was called. Brody had forced the issue. The whole town seemed to be gathered in the square. As Hannah and Takota rode in, stopping at the edge of the crowd, Brody stood on the courthouse steps, smug and confident, his men flanking him. Judge Leland emerged, holding a single file. His voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "I have reviewed the county ledgers and the title for the Moore homestead. There is no lien. No purchase agreement was ever filed." He looked directly at Brody. "Whatever private understanding you had, it died with James Moore. The property belongs to his widow. This matter is closed." Brody's face contorted with rage. "This is a sham. She's got you all bewitched. Her and her savage pet." He reached inside his coat, his hand emerging with the dark glint of a pistol, but the world seemed to move at 2 different speeds. For the crowd it was a blur. For Takota, it was a sequence of clear, simple movements. He flowed through the space between them like a striking hawk. There was a sharp crack of bone on bone as he slammed the side of his hand into Brody's rising arm. A shot exploded, tearing a hole in the empty sky. The pistol clattered onto the courthouse steps. In the next instant, Brody was flat on his back in the dirt, the air forced from his lungs, Takota's knee pinning his chest. The tip of the knife that had sat by the fire was now pressed against the soft flesh of Brody's throat. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Takota's face was a mask of cold fury, but his hand was steady, applying only enough pressure to command, not to kill. He didn't look at the wheezing man beneath him. He looked at Hannah. She held his gaze for a long second, then gave a single sharp nod. Takota stood up and stepped back as if from a coiled snake. Brody lay on the ground, choking on dust and humiliation, as the town watched in stunned silence. No one moved to help him. The judge came down the steps and handed a document to Hannah. "Your title, Mrs. Moore." Clear and settled. She took the paper with both hands. It felt heavy, solid. It was more than just a deed to a piece of land scorched by the sun. It was the deed to her own life, bought with water and fire, and finally, undeniably, hers. Summer's brutal heat finally broke, yielding to the golden light and cool, dry winds of autumn. The scorched earth softened. The cicadas fell silent. A sense of peace, deep and cleansing, settled over the ranch, and for the first time since James had died, Hannah felt the land breathe with her, not against her. Takota stayed. The question of his leaving was a ghost that no longer haunted the space between them. He worked the land with a quiet competence, his presence as steady and reliable as the sunrise. He still slept in the barn, still respected the threshold of her home, but the distance between them had become a comfortable geography, mapped by shared work and silent meals. One evening, she found him by the well, its stones dark with the memory of that first day. He was staring down into its depths. "This is where it began," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. He nodded, not looking at her. "A man can die of many things," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Thirst is only the quickest." He reached into a pouch at his belt and drew something out. He pressed it into her hand. It was a simple leather cord. Tied to it was a single, smooth, dark river stone, and beside it, the small, sharp feather of a hawk. It was cool against her skin. "The stone is for a spirit that does not break," he explained. "The feather is for a heart that sees what others do not." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes holding the soft light of dusk. "It is for the woman who saw a man, not an enemy." She felt the warmth of tears but did not let them fall. Without a word, she tied the cord around her neck. The stone came to rest in the hollow of her throat. It felt as if it had always been there. The town of Dry Hollow began to thaw. There were no apologies. That was not the way of these hard people, but the hostility receded like a low tide. On a trip to the general store, Henderson's wife gave her an extra scoop of flour, calling it a mistake. An old rancher who had once glared at her with open contempt now gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod as she passed on the street. They were small gestures, but they were a bridge back to the world. Sheriff Maddox came by one last time alone. He tipped his hat and accepted a cup of coffee on the porch. After a long silence, he gestured with his chin toward the barn, where Takota was mending a harness with patient, skillful hands. "Now that the trouble with Brody is settled, I expect he'll be moving on soon," Maddox said. More a statement than a question. Hannah watched the steady, rhythmic work of Takota's hands. She thought of the silence that was no longer lonely, and the safety that had nothing to do with locks or doors. "No, Sheriff," she said, her voice calm and sure. "I believe he's already home." Maddox looked at her, then at Takota, then back at her. A slow understanding dawned in his weary eyes. He grunted, a sound of reluctant acceptance, finished his coffee, and rode away. That night, they sat together on the top step of the porch, watching the stars ignite in the vast velvet sky. The autumn air was crisp and clean. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple gesture of trust and belonging. He did not stiffen or pull away. His presence was a solid, comforting warmth beside her. "Do you miss it?" she whispered to the darkness. "The life you knew before?" He was quiet for a long time, his gaze lost somewhere among the constellations. "I miss my people," he said at last. "But my spirit, it was tired of war. It is quiet here." He looked down at her, a silhouette against the starlight. "It is at peace." She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the brittle grass. It was no longer a lonely sound. It was the breath of the land, their land. A home born not of blood or law, but forged in a simple, profound act of kindness, a single cup of water offered in the dust.